Oh gosh, that's wow. I can see that. I'm terrible at math. The calculator was in a different orange when it passed the room again. That's why I was able to be to the chase with. Yeah, so good. I've still retained that skill in high school for the most part. It got worse after a while because you have to work. It does a whole lot more. And you really can't rely on it after that. And that's pretty much all that I'm doing. Work week. It's less about that, so there is a lot of that. There's some that involved. It's more about how it that's what
The dog that was trying to
Just took our exams yesterday. I hope you get it done.
Last semester. And it was all right. It was all right. I was able to answer some of the stuff there. It's this class was pretty good.
No, I mean, what's this?
Yeah, yesterday.
Yeah,
And did really well. And so I didn't know about that much. I didn't study that much. And I got to do this thing yesterday, and it's just, I might have done better than I think I did. So I feel good about that. I can say that.
How are we doing this morning?
Lacking Wi-Fi.
Lacking Wi-Fi?
Were you the only one that
Yeah, for like 3 hours last night.
Did it?
And apparently it included apartments off campus.
So
Like the
it's
close
just like
apartments off campus.
All internet is out. That's always fun. So we're gonna start moving into a little bit more information on natality and reproduction. This is gonna kind of help us transition into actually building some life tables, understanding how they work, a little bit more actual construction of population models, how to interpret population models, change management strategies based on their outputs, and so on. I am more than halfway through your tests. I will have them finished by next class. I apologize for the delay. The next test won't take me as well. As long as my kids don't get extremely sick again, I will have as long to get them great. You guys enjoy the trip on Tuesday?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you have liked to have seen more hands-on stuff? Like, I'm trying to, since this is the first year of teaching, I'm trying to think about how to. Would you think it'd be more worthwhile to try to get the entire day, pull you all out of class one day, and just go out and do a whole bunch of stuff in the field?
I think that would be great.
All right, so that was my mistake. I should have taken you guys all watch the entire day. Because yeah, we can then go out and do like habitat stuff. Look at habitat. Maybe I can convince them to burn something. Probably not. I can bring chainsaws though, so we can always do that. Okay, very good. Other announcements. Sign up for that extra credit opportunity with CWD testing. That sign up deadline is coming up. I've gotten a few of you added to the list, but we're running close on time. And depending on, that may change. Your mentality about wanting to do that may change based on your exam results. So I'll make sure that you have those results before that deadline, even if I can do the deadline. Yes, sir.
Email you to sign up?
Yes, just shoot me an email and I'll add you to the list. And remember, if you read the syllabus, there's a deadline to withdraw yourself from that because Fish and Wildlife will be counting on your presence at those check stations, especially now that CWD is not, going for so. Yes,
What day is that we have to show up? What day is it?
with the show, it's November 13th.
13th.
Yeah, Saturday, November 13th. It's an away football game, so no tailgating will be missed. I don't think basketball has started yet. I may be wrong. So, yes.
Will there be other opportunities? Students that just can't do that?
So, in terms of CWD testing or other extra credits,
Extra credit.
so Sarah came up with the key, right? These are probably it.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? Your lab exam is next week. Right? You will not have lecture the day of your lab exam. All right. Sarah and I are meeting tomorrow to figure out the logistics of it because 40 kids in that room is not going to work. Right. So we may end up meeting in here to do a slideshow component to that exam, and then taking you over to see the actual specimens at a different time / place. So pay attention to Canvas and announcements. And worst comes to worst, if you get confused, shoot Sarah or I an email. Okay? Well, whatever. Turn your, you have a phone, right?
That's true, that's true.
Use the Canvas app. Yep.
When you said you won't have lecture, would the lab exam start during lecture?
Yet to be determined. We may end up, based on space, splitting you to take, like where half of you are like sitting somewhere waiting. Because this is horrible, but we're trying to figure it out just because the class size is so big. Most of the other classes that have labs are like mammalogy is limited to 25 students, right? So we're at 40, we're at capacity. It's a little harder to squeeze you all in and ensure that, academic integrity is still there. We're figuring out. The first one's going to be the guinea pig, and then we'll have it figured out by the second and third exam. Okay. All right, so this should be a relatively short lecture, mostly because it's kind of finishing up part of what we already started discussing before the exam and building on the whole life tables, population pyramids kind of thing. Natality and reproduction really is the foundation of determining the potential rate of change of a population, right? So we have the mortality side, we have the loss of individuals, we have immigration and emigration potential, which is harder to measure. But this is definitely, if you have a zero birth rate, zero survival rate of young, your population is going to crash no matter what the death rate is. Because over time, it's going to end up, if you're not replacing, you're losing. So there's a couple things that we pay attention to in wildlife and terminologies of what we're looking at data-wise that can help inform whether or not a population is growing. And all of this really gets taken and put into those models that you guys did that basic construction, right? So the terminology may change a little bit, but you guys are not, these things should not be like new. So the way we measure growth is we can look at the fecundity rate. So the number of young possible per female. So this is like, basically think of this as maximum growth. This is the top level of growth for that species, and it alters by species. So for armadillos, it's 4. It's always 4 for our 9-banded armadillos because they basically have quadruplets every time. That's what they do. So it's either 4 or 0. So their maximum number per female every year is 4. the natality rate starts moving into a little bit more of what we're real life seeing, right? So it's the actual number that are produced per female. Then the recruitment rate is how many of those young per female get to where they can actually reproduce. And then productivity gets into this resource use mentality. So productivity generally is used for animals that are harvested or for animals that may get inadvertently killed. And all it comes down to, is there a surplus being produced that can be taken out without population crashing? So for white-tailed deer, this is how many animals are getting harvested each year without that population really suffering a loss. Questions on those terms? All right. So all that plays into how we measure reproductive success in ways. Now let's talk a little bit about how reproduction is affected, the ways it varies by species, and what actually is driving. So there's two main things that will drive when reproduction occurs and the length of the reproductive season. The phenology of plant growth, why would that matter?
Because that's a food source for many, many animals.
And what else?
Also, they provide cover.
Right? So if your young are being born in the winter and there's no food for them to eat or for you to eat to produce milk, it almost guarantees failure. The other component is photoperiod. And remember that these have evolved over time, generations and generations, to try to maximize the reproductive success. So when an animal gives birth, can be genetically linked, right? So that may pass down. So those that give birth earlier in the season when food is less available may put their young at a disadvantage. So it's kind of been maximized. And why that matters is if that changes, either the phenology of plant growth or the food source phenology, when it's most abundant changes, all of a sudden, all those animals that evolved over time to do best when it's supposed to be the most are not doing as well. The second component, photoperiod, is really linked heavily to hormone levels. So the amount of sunlight is generally what we're talking about, where it increases hormone levels within different species that triggers them to start going into reproductive status. So there's a, for the hunters, how many deer hunters are in here? All right, so when is the peak of the rut for bucks? Like, when is the best time to go hunt bucks? When are they supposed to be peaking? Yeah, is it related to the moon? Have you ever heard it's related to the moon? Like deer activity? No? Yes? So there's this whole idea that buck movement and the rut is timed to the moon phase and when that happens. And it's completely incorrect, because every year it happens at almost the same time by geographic region. And that's because the genetics of the animals in that location, the amount of sunlight per day is linking to when those does are coming into estrus, which is what's driving the system. That has nothing to do with moon phase. So that's kind of a misnomer that's in the hunting community. But it's a great example of how sunlight triggers melatonin levels, which kicks in all the other things. It starts antler growth in males, and it also then triggers females to go into estrus in the fall. So these are the two things that kind of drive when reproduction occurs within an animal. Now, do you guys see a problem if you're a species that's triggered by photoperiod within, think the hemisphere, right? So we're kind of slowly creeping further north. What if you were right in the middle? Do the day lengths vary like they do here? No, they're pretty consistent, right? So animals that are triggered by photoperiod for reproduction, they get really goofy along the equator. And we'll get into why that matters here and not too long. But, the other thing here with this one, the phenology of plant growth, we're seeing some issues popping up now with some of our wildlife species, like birds, that their nest timing and when they start laying eggs and when those eggs hatch had previously been linked to insect reproduction, right? So the eggs actually were timed to hatch when the caterpillars were really coming out, and where the moths were really coming out, because that was their primary food source. Well, with climate change, insects tend to be able to respond quicker to changes in temperature and weather patterns. So they may have moved up their peak reproduction by a week or two, but things like birds are not that quick to adapt because their generation time is slower. So all of a sudden there's this unbalance to that evolutionary time period of maximum food. And our birds are starting to suffer and not being as reproductively savvy and are a little bit more limited by food. So just an example of an indirect impact of climate change that we're seeing. All right, so the next one, so we have when reproduction occurs, then we get into ovulation rates, litters, and clutch sizes, which are impacted by two main things: your age and then your health. Right? So every species pretty much has a prime period for the reproduction and when they are peak reproductive ability. It usually is associated with adulthood in some sense, which also means that they're probably also at their peak nutritional level they can be at in that area. Just because they're the same age, but maybe in two different areas, their ovulation rates, litters, and clutch sizes can vary if their nutritional levels are different. The next section for this is gestation and incubation. All right, and this is something that's kind of hard to measure, but can be drastically impacted by several issues like disturbance, disease, and nutrition. Okay, so this is, we have lots of species in mammals that while they are pregnant, if their nutritional quality goes down, or if they have a traumatic event, they will abort some or all of their fetuses. So understanding that, say we have more disturbances that are occurring, if that rate increases or there's a disease outbreak, you can kind of predict whether or not the prenatal survival is going to crash that year or potentially in future years. Questions on that? Yes.
Did you say they'll like reduce the emotion?
Yeah, they'll reabsorb the fetus. Yeah, if they're nutritionally stressed. If you think about it, they've invested something into that fetus, and they can literally dissolve it back and get all the nutrition back from it. Yeah, and we think that happens more often than we'd expect. That at least some of the potential clutch or litter sizes are given up. All right. So we're moving now down to parental care, where food and nutrition becomes a bigger issue. Can the females provide enough food for their chicks? Can they ingest enough food to produce enough milk? Those all could play a role. Then you get into some goofy things with individual species where raptors will sometimes play favorites with their young. And a lot of times that's kind of how they deal with the food scarcity, is they will put more resources into the larger chick. And if there's enough resources around, they're able to get a large chick and a small chick. If there's limited resource, they just get a large chick. Sometimes that small chick gets eaten by the other chick. Sometimes it gets eaten by mom or dad. So there's potentially a lot at play there. Usually though, these are a factor of other things going on in the landscape that can be controlled and managed for. Then there's other impacts. So several species are sensitive to densities of their counterparts, where if you have too many of a certain species in an area, they'll either wait to sexually mature and become, they won't actually become technically recruited into the reproducing population, right? Or they will have a lot less young. Sometimes, you know, so the lack of recruitment is kind of the term delayed development in some ways. So this can happen. I'm trying to think of a good example. The one that's popping in my mind is not a great example. We'll go with it because nothing else is there. If you think about wolves in a pack, you have the alphas that are the only ones that reproduce. So even the juveniles that are present in that pack, the other adults, technically they're not reproducing adults. They're not a part of the population that actually is increasing it, right? So you could have 10 females in a pack, but only one of them is breeding. So technically they haven't been recruited in unless they break off and form their own pack and they're reproducing. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay. All right. So in terms of reproductive patterns, we talked about the two different things that kind of drive when reproduction happens, but there's also different patterns in terms of how much reproduction occurs during that time. A lot of time with our hoofed animals, we have this synchronous one-time reproduction event during a season. That's really geared towards a couple different things. One, it's time when the food is most available. And a lot of times, because these are hoofed animals, they're prey. So you have things like wolves, bears, mountain lions that can eat them, other large carnivores. And their young are also very vulnerable. So the term the term is predator swamping. So they'll have so many young at one point in time that the predators can't catch all of them before they're mobile. So that's a good example of why synchronous birth is good. Yes.
So you said hoofed animals. Largely, what about hoofed animals that are in like tropical systems where the food is
We'll get into
available?
that. Yeah, so that whole photoperiod thing, that's why, so the photoperiod tends to be really important with these guys because it's the most predictable, right? It's consistent. Sunlight lengths are pretty much almost always the same year to year. Temperature and even, well, temperature is really a big one. Rainfall, all those are unpredictable. Photoperiod is fairly predictable. So if you're trying to predator swamp, you want everyone to drop it almost at the same time. Another slight alteration of that, it's still synchronous. So the majority of the population is having their young about the same time, but it can happen twice a year or more. And that's the bimodal. So things like squirrels will have an early season litter, and then they'll have a late summer litter. Almost all of them are having litters at the exact same time. Birds are a little bit less synchronous, but they will nest multiple times in their reproductive season. Most of them try to initiate at the same time. It's whether or not that failure is occurring at similar times that would keep it going. All right. Then you can take this even further, trimodal, where you basically have species that just almost continuously reproduce. All right. Rabbits, right? They reproduce like rabbits, that terminology. Rabbits will have many, many litters a year. The further south you get, where the winter season and food availability is there, so summer and food availability is lengthened, you will get more litters. Muskrats are kind of the same thing. Many of the rodents, all the mice, voles, they would typically fall in this strategy. Muskrats can have up to 6 litters a year. They will reproduce longer into the winter than most. Rabbits are kind of the same thing. Doves fit into this. Doves will just keep nesting and nesting. So these tend to be the species, especially the larger ones, that were hunted and trapped consistently because their reproductive rate is so high that they're able to withstand that take. Okay.
Is this related to the RK species?
Yeah. So this is like R to the
Yeah,
extreme.
that's what-
Yeah. Even, so these are a little bit more on the K side. It doesn't necessarily mean they're completely that. Because this can happen on an annual basis. The further along the K spectrum you get, it can happen, every couple of years or thereabouts. Then you get into this whole asynchronous, where there's no actual pattern to the animals going into reproductive status, and they'll just have young whenever they kind of are nutritionally able to. Yep.
So for bimodal, trimodal, and asynchronous species, are rates measured per year or per reproductive cycle?
It's generally measured per year, but you have to be able to collect enough data to understand. Because so you get into this, you'll have individuals that may only have 1 litter, and then you'll have those that are older and healthier that will have multiple litters. So you have to get a good gauge of what is the average number of litters and litter size for that population.
I guess this is gonna be a weird question, but is this like absent of them completing a pregnancy? Because like elephants are pregnant for like 16 months or something, or 2 years, something like that. So then they wouldn't fall into any of these. So pregnancy link also.
We
causes
fall much more
elephant-
into this,
Okay,
so the apes, elephants, those that are not reproducing on an annual basis, they kind of reproduce at their point in time when they're mature, and it can happen at any point basically.
because the pregnancy is so.
That tends to complicate things, right?
What would sea turtles be, out of curiosity?
Sea turtles,
They generally come onto the beach all at once and have their hatching all at once. But,
unless they lay multiple clutches. So some turtles lay multiple clutches, if I'm remembering correctly, we said herpetology. Right? They will have multiple clutches, like snakes. You may get into a bimodal situation. So how does that look in terms of population and growth? So asynchronous, or synchronous, I'm sorry, not asynchronous. Synchronous does not mean that all animals have birth the same day or almost the same day. It just means there tends to be this big hump, so a large percentage. So if you look here, within about 15 days, you have roughly 60 to 70% of the births happen. Okay. This is pretty similar. Our elk are like this. Many of our deer, although it depends on a couple of things, but most synchronous births, unimodal synchronous births, you have a very tight window of the majority of the births happening. Bimodal is a little less time predictable, right? It just may happen where you get two relatively similar peaks to unimodal. Why do you think this is a little lower? Any ideas, Erica? Hand wasn't up.
I'm just taking a guess, but maybe it was later in the year, less resources.
Well, not necessarily less resources.
Is it when they're raising, like they need
So if you have
resources to raise them young?
If you have a litter here,
Yeah.
are all your resources going to making sure you're healthy? No, they're going to try to raise that young. So you're less likely, if you're an individual that maybe was healthy enough to have a first litter, nutritionally you now might be stressed, you're less likely to pop out a second one. So this, we lose probably a lot of the yearling or the first time they're reproducing, in the second, where you don't always have that uniform, similar reproductive rate. So you would want to basically know either total reproduction over the year, or try to calculate what's the first litter size, second litter size. Okay, because if you had something like a major disturbance event here, you would probably lose all of that reproduction for the second litter. So it allows you to understand the population growth a little bit better if you have estimates of both of the bimodal efforts. All right. So in terms of the photoperiod for the unimodals, if you're an animal that is linked heavily to photoperiod, and you go down and you have part of your range goes further and further south, or further and further north, but gets closer to the equator, that photoperiod triggering is all out of whack. So what ends up happening is within the population, you'll have certain individuals that are coming into reproductive status, some that are coming out of reproductive status, some that are completely the opposite time of year. And you may have, so it's the Bambi scenario. You will never see a fully antlered male buck with an adult doe with a 2-day-old fawn in the Northern Hemisphere, right? Unless you go down to South Florida, Central America, where the photoperiod has them so screwed up, you may have a buck running around in full rut with a doe that has a 5-day-old fawn, and he's chasing her around, even though she's not in reproductive status. And it's all because their photoperiod and the trigger of that, those hormones is screwed up because it's not as distinct as it is at the extreme parts of the range. That makes sense?
Saying they'll just keep producing.
No, so they just come in and out of status at different times. So
there's
they-
no, you're saying it's not synchronous?
It's not synchronous. Yeah, so they can actually go out of that synchrony, where there has to be some individuals that are still, right, so if the population didn't have individuals that were actually overlapping in their reproductive status, you wouldn't get any reproduction. So there's just simply some individuals that are reproducing at that point in time, some that are not, or they may be in later stages of that cycle.
Do you see it get thrown off at all in the Northern Hemisphere when they're in, like breeding, like farming?
Farm.
Yeah, like whitetail farms.
Sure, so
Does that throw off their breeding pattern?
so the evolution of it is pretty strong. So we did a lot of restocking of deer when they almost went extinct in like 1900. So we were pulling deer from all over the place and bringing them down to the south, bringing southern deer to the north. So Alabama is a prime example. So the state of Alabama has source population of 4 different subspecies of deer. Some, the borealis species from Canada, some from Kentucky, some from Pennsylvania, and some from like Texas. Alabama's rut has 4 peaks because it all depends on, and so they brought those animals in and they didn't mix them. So they let them go in certain parts of the state. So each part of the state has its own peak associated with where those source animals came from.
Why would you bring 4 different?
That's where they can
species
find
and
it.
then not have them?
That's where they could find the deer at that time to restock. We went from, we have 35 million white-tailed deer right now. We're down to like maybe 50,000 in the entire range of the species. That's how overexploited they were. Well, they're there now. 35 million ish.
I'm sure it was way higher before that too.
Well, yeah.
In the scenario you described, can that result in reproductive isolation and then speciation?
Sure. Yep. Yeah. Generally, though, what would probably happen first is a shift towards a timing of individuals. And there is, so like the Everglades there with white-tailed deer, there is still a synchronous group that kind of pop out fawns almost the same time. It's not, all over the place, but I had pictures from Panama when I was doing research down there, and literally a day-old fawn walked in front of the camera, and then a buck that was full-on rutted up did it walk the next day. So it can depend. Wait.
So, like the patterns, can they, are they like a species-wide thing, or like can they mostly like vary by region?
There's definitely some regional impacts, right? And even within the same subspecies, we tend to see localities, especially with the synchronous unimodals. There's area of the state and groups that will all pop out like within a day or two. Even though it may be like a 15-day window, locality-wise, it may be a 2 or 3 day window. And when you think about it, the whole predator swamping idea really works on a local level. Like you want all the other females within that immediate area dropping at the exact same time, so that those predators that are in that immediate area can't find them all. If you spread them out over 15 days in a very small locale, you don't get the same effect of the swamping.
I've actually heard of, this was described to me at BCTC one time. Racehorse farmers, they'll have the mares put in barns that have the lights on at different times of the year to mimic estrus, and trade that early on, because in the world of horses, the horse's birth date is always registered at the very beginning of the year as opposed to the month it was actually born. And if you're trying to make a really good racehorse, that doesn't work very well if you have a 2-year-old horse that was born in November when it's registered as January, because the horse born in January is going to be your 1.25-year-old horse anytime. And so they'll have the mares give birth earlier in January as opposed to later in the year when they usually give birth, just by having the lights on at different times of the year.
Yeah, because they're photoperiod generated. Yep. So we do the same thing with snakes in captivity. They can actually time brumation and reproduction to that, or they can change the temperature because they're a little more sensitive to temperature than photoperiod. So they'll drop the temperature for a longer period of time and basically make them think it's winter. So they're cued a little bit more by that. All right. So in a lot of situations, we have some impact of density on reproduction. That could simply be competition for nutrition. However, there's a little bit more of an extreme impact in certain species where if there's a lot of other individuals around, regardless of nutrition levels, they tend to regulate themselves and won't produce as many. Either their litter size will be small or their clutch size will be small. So that, that kind of does two things. One, it limits your growth for the entire population. but it also means that you may have a cohort of females that are at their peak production health and age that simply won't produce like you would expect them to, because there's a density impact. So that may mean they're healthier and they can produce longer, or depending on the species, they may just not ever meet that maximum production they could have had for their lifespan. These happen a lot with cycles, species that cycle. Sometimes, quail cycle a little bit, game birds in general cycle a little bit, grouse. So in periods where grouse cycle up, they tend to, almost at that peak, the females will have a smaller clutch size. Seems counterintuitive, but it kind of regulates them from that, basically exceeding carrying capacity.
Do you ever see like population dwindle and then like them adapt to the smaller population and never, like, over long periods of time, will they recognize that as like their density? Then
So does that density change over time? I don't know. I have to look that up. I'm not sure. I would think that if the habitat didn't change, because it's more driven by carrying capacity, that maybe the density per carrying capacity changes rather than the population itself changes. I'll have to check into that. All right, so examples of this. So deer are a good one, where they will start, especially the juveniles will start producing less young when their numbers increase. So that has a little bit to do with fawning territories, what's available, nutrition, but also just basically a recognition that there's more animals around. They are really bad at it though, because they will very quickly go over their carrying capacity. So it's more number of animals will cause this to decrease, and probably not as much a self-regulatory as it is a habitat regulatory. So a health, nutritional issue. All right, so how do we collect this data? If we want to calculate the fecundity rate, the natality, with mammals, we're usually looking in reproductive tracts, and we're looking for either follicles in the ovary or corpora lutea, which are basically, let's see here, a egg. So, all right, here. So I don't like this one as much. We'll go to the next one. There's also the placental scars and how that all works. So the follicle rate, so the number of follicles in the ovary, is basically the more follicles a female has, the higher the chance or more young they can produce. Okay. When the follicles develop and mature, you finally get into the corpus luteum. That's how many eggs potentially could be fertilized. All right. So it's correlated, but not always directly. And then how that then transfers over to the natality rate is we look at basically for the implantation scars. So when we do a lot of the ungulates, we'll look for these dark marks where an egg was fertilized in the uterine horns, and those are basically placental scars. That does not mean that placenta became a full fetus and was born. It just means it was fertilized. A lot of times with deer, they will have 3 or 4 fertilized eggs each season, but only 2 or 1 will actually become a fetus to be born. However, if the animal is unhealthy, the number of scars, so the number of eggs released to be fertilized is lower. Also, if they're not reproductive status, they aren't healthy enough or old enough to be reproductive status, you won't see anything in the reproductive tract. Yes.
So in like pigs, horses, and I believe cattle as well, one of the horns will get saggy.
Yeah.
So do you see that as well? They go back better than farm
They,
animals? Cause like a
I
cow-
have never seen a saggy.
Cause like in a cow, you can see if they've like carried a pregnancy, because the uterine horn won't reshape as well as it needs to.
Are you talking about specifically a certain species or just wild animals in general?
Well,
Trying to think about, I've looked at deer and elk and otter, and I've never seen saggy. So I don't know. I've never looked at a pig or a cow though, so I may have been seeing saggy and just not know.
Basically, they get stretched out when they like carry the
Yeah,
fetus, and then
would
they
make
don't
sense.
reform the way they need to.
that would make sense
And then they're more likely to carry another pregnancy there.
after it's been stretched.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's more surface area for attachment. That would make sense if they do that as well in wild and species, but I'm not sure. We can find out, check station. If you want, or I can bring one in and we can take a look. So when we're collecting this information, a lot of times with harvested species, it's during that harvest time period. And it's not necessarily an indication of how healthy that animal is currently, but how healthy that animal was in the previous reproductive season. So these scars basically all came from that previous season. Now, if you did this in January for deer or elk that have gone through that cycle already, then you'd be detecting that breeding season at that time. However, telling when these scars occurred is almost impossible. You would be looking for fetuses though during that time period. And Kate's going to come in and do a talk, my grad student, and we do ultrasounds on our elk when we catch them. So you can actually I'll have her show pictures of what that looks like. Because during January, the fetus is already about the size of a racquetball. So it's easy to see. For deer, it's probably about the size of 3-4 inches. So a little smaller than that ping pong ball. Questions on this? So we can do this pretty much with almost all of our mammal species. And we do use it for all of our mammal species. The problem is right, so the scars is a natality rate. Does that mean that animal survived to recruitment? No. One of the things that we look at with this is a relationship between the number of follicles that may have been fertilized to the number of scars for it that actually took. And because an animal that is nutritionally stressed or stressed for other reasons will not have as many scars. So it can be used as an indicator of something being wrong with limiting your natality rate. So with birds, we look at number of eggs produced being the fecundity rate. We have two types of situations where you have determinate layers and indeterminate layers. Who's in animal science? Okay, you guys should be able to explain this. Yes? No? No one? What do you think they are? What do you think the difference could be?
Are they not been fertilized?
Nope.
The layers of the egg.
Nope. So a bird lays an egg. Bird lays another egg. Maybe 3, maybe 4. What point does that bird stop laying eggs and start sitting? Do they change, make up their mind? Or is there potentially, like, I have 4 eggs, it's time for me to start incubating? Yes, no? Set number, unset number. So quail will lay eggs until they reach 12, and then they will incubate. So if you have quail and they get to 10 eggs and you take all 10 eggs, the quail will start laying again and keep laying. However, if you let it get to 12, then they sit on them and stop laying eggs. Don't ask me why it's 12. I have no idea. There's got to be some reason. It's probably related to the maximum number of chicks they can hatch and watch and take care of.
Is that like 12 eggs period, or if someone would like take away eggs, would they lay more to get to
They
12?
would keep going until they got to 12. So makes it nice if you have captive quail and you want quail eggs, you can just literally take 1 egg a day and they'll keep going. But if you want them to produce chicks and get more quail, then you just let them stop and go. Yeah.
Is there ever a stopping point?
With quail, no. Well, they go out of reproductive status. The hormone levels change because of photoperiod. So that's kind of weird, right? So slightly different in terms of reproductive tracts. Birds have basically 1 tract that produces eggs, not the 2. It is the left side that develops, and then it actually during breeding season it enlarges and becomes active, and then regresses and shrinks away during non-breeding season. Takes about 23, 24 hours to form an egg. The entire process, which I thought I had, there it is. From going from the ovary, all the different layers it needs. And when they occur, I don't really care about this, just know it takes a day. But it basically is because the egg is so complex with all its components, it is formed in this basically a assembly line, okay? What each of those is important to the success of the egg, and depending on the nutritional level of the bird, some of these may be lacking, right? So I believe I've mentioned calcium levels and calcium being bound up in soil. When that happens for birds, the shell itself is weak and does not form. Therefore, it lowers its survival rate. So all of these are important to this egg making it to hatching. All of them can be altered or potentially become victim to an environmental issue or a nutritional issue.
How much is this test?
I don't know, I haven't made the test yet.
Oh, yeah, good point.
I mean, how much do you want it to be on there?
Honestly, if you just say, gives nourishment, that's fine with me. Because we already know that one.
All right. So how do we measure reproduction of birds? Well, fecundity rate's number of eggs, right? So the number of eggs hatched is that natality rate, same as giving birth. We can look at, we can get a little more detailed in terms of how many eggs are fertilized, right? We can handle them because they may lay 12 eggs, 2 or 3 maybe what we call slugs that are not fertilized or don't develop. So you can actually track the development success rate of each egg by looking, candling it, looking for the veins and watching that chick develop inside. Yes.
Can you candle snakes
Yes.
and reptiles?
Yes.
So camping is for community, or-
Candling allows you to track fecundity rate a little bit better.
Okay.
So number of eggs is great, but what we really want are number of viable eggs, right?
Okay.
And candling allows us to determine if an egg is viable or not. Eventually, we'll figure it out when it doesn't hatch, but instantaneously, if you're only visiting a nest once and you want that information, you candle the egg.
Okay.
All right, that's pretty much it for natality and reproduction. All of this will factor into how you monitor populations and build population models to better manage species and predict whether or not they are in distress. You guys all heard about, they finally gave up on the ivory-billed woodpecker and a few other species?
Yeah, I heard about that last
Yeah.
night.
Oh, well. Was it 23, I think, were deemed extinct?
That's like the highest they've ever done.
Yeah, it's kind of odd. It seems political that they just, certain administrations will finally give up. And they like, most of those haven't been seen since like 1980. So why did it take 40-ish years to finally say, come out? Well, it is what it is. All right, questions? Yes.
On the egg layer, the different things, like, is there a certain one they give up first if they're not healthy, or does it matter?
So the egg
Or
layer.
like, there's like the old shell and stuff.
Oh, that would depend, because each one of those requires different things. So it would depend on what they're stressed for. Pay attention to Canvas, look for our messages. What's that? I was gonna ask that. Do you guys, do other faculty members give the test back?
Well, usually you can see what you got wrong.
That's,
So whether like if it's on Canvas, they like show it.
I'm very hesitant to give them out.
Yeah, I would, the problem is then you don't know what you got wrong. The
Correct.
cumulative time.
Yes, I understand. I mean, I get it.
You could hand it out in class.
I could, yeah.
And then have us hand it back in.
That might be, that was the route I was following. So, yes.
Do you know where I could buy a crossbow quiver around here?
Quiver?
Oh, yeah.
One second.
I went to Whitetail, when they were sold out. And Cabela's, I looked online, it doesn't look like they had